Let me ask everybody here to think about something for just a second. Don't share it with anyone. Just think about it yourself. What is the single most important thing to you? Just think about that for a second. What is the single most important thing to you? And I'm going to get back to that in a minute, if you remember that one thought. But I'm going to give you a romp down memory lane as to where the media were. Some of you are old enough now to remember this in 1987, when I started the Media Research Center 32 years ago. At that time, you had 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. You had 2 wire services, AP, UPI. You had Time, Newsweek, US News. You had a handful of newspapers, and that was it. Now, what did they all have in common? Every single one of them was liberal. Conservatives didn't have a single voice in the national news media. If you wanted a conservative perspective, you would get it from Paul Harvey in the afternoon in Chicago. Remember that? He would have a 2-minute commentary. Or you got it from National Review every 2 weeks, or you got it from Human Events with a circulation of 30,000. Or you got it in direct mail, or you got it through pigeons. But you didn't get it from the national news media. So I thought it was time for conservatives to set up an organization to take on the press. And I remember the first meeting that I had with 3 supporters. We were in a little conference room, the conference table I had scotch taped on the side. We had 1 rented computer. We had a black and white TV set. We had 7 phones. We got a good deal, but we could only afford 2 desks to go with them. And one of our supporters said something to me that was quite interesting. She said, "Who the hell do you think you are?" And she was a supporter. And she was making a valid point. We were proposing to go up against a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I gave her 2 reasons why we needed to be supported. One was that if we weren't supported, then everything else that the conservative movement was involved with, it might as well throw out the window. Because we were faced with a situation that had been for years. Well, like that Greek figure Sisyphus, where he's pushing the boulder up the mountain and it only rolls back down on him. We would have great ideas, but at the moment of getting them out to the American people, we had to go through this prism called the national news media. And our ideas went in as prime steak and they came out raw sewage on the other end to the American people. Perception of reality is reality in politics, and the perception was that conservatives were either evil or crazy or both. The second reason that I had for her supporting it was that I thought that the media, this multi-billion-dollar industry, had an Achilles heel: credibility, which had never been called into question before. In 1987, believe it or not, 75% of the American people believed the media were objective. By the way, memo to selves, there is no such thing. Unless you've had a frontal lobotomy, other than that, you have an opinion on life. There is no such thing as objectivity. So when somebody says they're objective, that's nonsense. So that was 1987. We began. In 1988, 1 year later, radio was deregulated and Rush Limbaugh came on the scene. Now, I want to tell you something about Rush. He enjoys, I believe, as an unsung statement, one of the strongest business successes in this country's history. So think about this for a second. He came in first place. 31 years later, thousands of competitors later, he's still #1 by a massive margin. Nobody comes close to the guy. Now, why was it? Because Rush had a certain message that was resonating with that American people that was getting nothing but liberalism. I remember getting a call from a girlfriend of ours. I'd had some back surgery, hadn't heard from her in years, and she called and she said, "Brent, I just heard." And I said, "Well, that's nice, but it's just nothing. It's just back surgery." She said, no, I just heard. And I said, "Look, I'm telling you, it wasn't serious, but thank you for calling." And she said, "No, I just heard this guy Rush Limbaugh, and I had to talk to you about it." I told Rush a story about driving in Iowa. I was giving a speech somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and I stopped in this little town to get a cup of coffee, and this RV half the size of that town pulled up next to me. Just this massive thing. And this elderly couple got out. And they recognized me, and we shared a cup of coffee, and we were talking, and they told me that they were from Arizona, and they were on their way to Dallas for one of his professional conventions or something. And I tried to point out gently to this elderly couple that Iowa's not on the way to Dallas if you're coming from Arizona. And they said, oh, that's okay. We just like to wander around the country because we like to listen to Rush Limbaugh on our radio. And I told Rush, somewhere in America, there's a massive RV with two 75-year-olds just meandering and listening to you. That was 1988. 1995 comes the first major conservative website called Town Hall. Now go back to 1995 and think in the world that we were thinking in. That was what, 24 years ago? If my math is right, less than a quarter of a century ago. I was invited to go on the board of this thing, and I went to New York, and George Gilter, some of you who may know who he is, had written a pamphlet for the board members to study the night before, because we didn't know what the hell this town hall thing was. And in there he said, imagine wanting to climb the Himalayan mountains, but not knowing what it's like. Now you can on a computer. He said, imagine wanting to watch any movie you want. Now you hit some keys, and it comes on a computer. He said, imagine going grocery shopping, but you don't go to Safeway, you go to your screen, and you hit some commands, and groceries are put together, then you go pick them up. And I read this, and I thought, this man is insane. What in the world is he talking about? Well, of course, yeah, it doesn't really resonate, because of course that can be done. But in 1995, it was a pipe dream that you could do that. 1996 comes the next inflection point. September of 96, Fox News is born. It took Fox News no time at all to become #1 in cable. If my math is correct, they've been in first place for 208 consecutive months, which again is unheard of. Now, who is their competition? Well, watch out, CNN. Some new numbers on CNN. You folks are going to like this. Average primetime audience is down 26% since the last quarter. It is now tipping in at around 767,000 people. That, ladies and gentlemen, adds up to 0.2% of the American population. That's through CNN. Put it further in perspective, you could put the entire audience of CNN in Richmond, Virginia, and still have real estate left over. Put it in perspective. There are 2 times as many people who call themselves witches as viewers of CNN. Put it in perspective. More people in this country say they own poultry as pets as watch CNN. And a final factoid. In America, there are more whores than there are viewers of CNN. True story, true story. In 1997 came the first blog, the web blog, whatever they call them. The first blog came in 1997, and it started changing. Instead of it being a website, it was more opinion that you were getting. 1998, we launched cnsnews.com, which was the first online news site. Today, after you look at all those things, conservatives are active on every single front. Whether it is newspapers, we dominate radio, we've got a presence on television, we've got blog sites, we've got websites, we've got all of these things. We're still tremendously outnumbered. But now, as opposed to 1987, when we had no voice, we have plenty of voice. In 2004, the conservative movement, I think, hit its biggest inflection point to date with Rathergate. What was Rathergate? September 2004, CBS sprung this Wednesday night program with Dan Rather that suggested that in 1977, George Bush took a week off from the National Guard. This is really important stuff, by the way. You know, they always used to say about Bill Clinton that move on from Whitewater, move on from Monica Lewinsky, that's old news. But they were fixated on what George Bush did in 1977 in the National Guard when he took 1 week off, allegedly. And in this big breathless report that they came out with, it was based on a person making these accusations in the middle of the night. There were two bloggers who were looking at that in their underwear and different places, and they said, you know, that kind of looks like Microsoft Word. And in 1971, you had typewriters, not Microsoft Word. And so they did a couple of blogs on there the next morning. I don't know if you all recognize Rob Bluey, who is now the head of the Daily Signal at the Heritage Foundation. He was an intern of mine. That next morning, he brought in the 3 top typography experts in the country and questioned them, and every single one of them said this is a fake. And then with that, I won't go through all the details, but the story immediately fell apart. So we did a story on this. We gave it to Rush. Rush broke it at noon. Then Hannity had it at 3. Levin had it at 6. Hannity had it back again at 9 o'clock on his show. By the next morning, everybody in the press was headed for the tall grass. Now, this is something that could not have been done in 1987. Suddenly, we had a voice. Something else then happened, though, in 2004. There was a company that went public. It was called Google. 2005, a new company was founded. It was called YouTube. 2006, another company was founded. It's called Facebook. Also in 2006, another company was founded called Twitter. And when those 4 companies went big, the entire media landscape changed. We'd begun in 1987 with the old media, the traditional media, and we'd gone from there to the new media, to radio, to websites, and the like. But now we were going to the third kind of media, social media. And in no time at all, they transformed it because of the audience. Today, Twitter, 371 million people use it every month. Facebook, 2.2 billion. Google, on its search engine, controls 92.5% of all search engine searches worldwide. YouTube, 300 million hours of YouTube are added every minute. 5 billion videos are watched every day. Compare that to NBC News. All of this happened in the course of 15 years. What was also transforming? Not only were the social media transforming it, but the far left was transforming liberalism. You put those things together, and the whole world suddenly changed. Suddenly, where conservatives seemed to have an inroad, suddenly conservatives were under attack unlike any time they had been before. In 1987, there was the bias against conservatives. By 2019, the far left was weaponized, trying to destroy conservatives. In 1987, there was the bias by omission where they just wouldn't report what we were doing. In 2019, they don't report anything because they don't want us to exist. Talk shows, radio, television, websites, every single one of those media with a conservative presence have now been attacked with the intent of destroying them. And it's being done in the most dishonest ways imaginable. Rush Limbaugh was the subject of a boycott just 3 years ago, where hundreds of thousands of people were railing against him, trying to shut down companies, his advertisers all over the country. He hired this guy, Brian Gliglick, who is the top internet detective there is. Brian went deep, 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 deep into this media, and he found that rather than being hundreds of thousands of people, it was 17 people with state-of-the-art technology. Television. You have Tucker Carlson has been targeted. You got the Daily Caller also, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity. They've all been targeted in these boycotts. The boycott against the Daily Caller is the same as the boycott against Breitbart, where you had this operation called Sleeping Giants. What was Sleeping Giants? Well, nobody knew what Sleeping Giants was. It was just called Sleeping Giants. And they were going after every advertiser. As Breitbart came up on the screen, there's always a new ad that it's a pop-up ad, rotating pop-up ad. Every time there was a pop-up ad, immediately there was a letter that went out to that advertiser. Dear Avis, did you know you were advertising on a white supremacist group? Here's a letter that talks about it. Another left-wing group wrote the letter and gave it to Avis, and Avis is looking at it, and Avis says, well, there's no reason I need to do it. So they got rid of it. And it happened 198 times. They've been targeted. The tech companies now have decided they're coming after conservatives. I just want you to think about these numbers. Facebook now has 15,000 people monitoring content. It has a document 1,400 pages long on the rules of engagement. 500 pages are dedicated to the word hate, meaning what conservatives can and can't believe. Facebook has announced as a worldwide entity that it's putting a higher priority on European Parliament than on the American Constitution. That the European idea of virtue, whatever that might be, over freedom, tops the American ideal of freedom over virtue. And therefore, the Constitution is not something that they consider sacrosanct. Therefore, they've come after us on the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, which is why they're doing it. They just came out with an audit right now that came out 6 months ago, in which 90 left-wing organizations worked at Facebook on a quote-unquote independent audit, which made a number of demands, including more diversification, as if they needed even more control, and oversight on the electoral process. Sheryl Sandberg read that report and said it was going to be a top priority for Facebook in 2019. Google has a Trust and Safeguard Council which it uses to blacklist conservatives. Google said in testimony in the Congress that it doesn't do manipulation of its algorithms. Daily Caller blew the whistle on them. They are absolutely manipulating their algorithms to do things like what? To call Kate Cole James anti-immigration. She is, by the way, a black lady. She just happens to be the head of the Heritage Foundation. Twitter. I love this. Jack Dorsey, the founder of it, said last year, he said, I don't believe that we can afford a neutral stance. Well, he meant what he said. Trump Jr. is being censored. Trump Sr., they said that they are finding his ads potentially, quote unquote, offensive, his posts, and are going to say so. They're starting to go after the pro-life movement in a big way, unplanned. They refuse to allow it to go forward. But here's an example of the nuttiness that is Twitter. So on New Year's Eve last year, Brooke Baldwin from CNN was doing a tweet, and she was talking about her colleague, Don Lemon, who was drunk. And she called him #DrunkDonLemon. So one of my staff people did a blog on this, just simply reported what she had said, laughing about her colleague. He was banned for 15 days. Asked why? This is the answer that Twitter gave us. It promoted violence against, threatened, or harassed other people on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, disability, or serious disease. Now that pretty much covers everything, and that's what we had somehow done wrong. But speaking of gender identity and gender, I've said this to a few people. Do you know you cannot use the words Bruce and Jenner, or you'll be banned from Twitter, because Bruce, you see, is a dead name. Bruce is the name you had before you became your real sex. So it's transgender phobic something or other. You'll be banned. A professor in Canada wrote these words, "A woman is not a man." She was banned from Twitter for doing that, because a woman could be a man. On and on it goes. Now it's the service companies that are involved. Microsoft now has this thing called NewsGuard, where they rate every network, every show on the website. So if you have Breitbart, it's red light. Drudge is red light. And all Drudge does is it takes other people's material, but it's gotten a red light. PayPal. PayPal will not process some credit cards for some Christian organizations. Neither will Chase Bank. Apple is openly raising money as much as it can for SPLC. And by the way, if you're on Facebook and you volunteer do volunteer work at SPLC, Facebook will pay you. Third level, now you got journalism enterprises that are funded by the far left. They're now trying to give credibility to these attacks on conservatives. The Poynter Institute, just 3 days ago, had to take back a report they came out with, where they came out with about 20 organizations that they said were either biased, unreliable, or clickbait. And it was the most ridiculous study you ever saw. Breathlessly, they announced that the MRC was biased. You think? They also, on the flip side of it, they had no description for National Review. Can you imagine Bill Buckley saying, what does it take for me to be called a conservative in this town? I mean, they just blew it across the board. But you've got those groups now. Here's the bottom line that I'm trying to get across to you. The attacks on freedom are real. The attacks on what you believe are real. It is not that they're fighting you on what it is you believe. It is that they do not want to allow what you believe in the public conversation. The public conversation is no longer websites or the news media. We are now in the information age, the communications era. If you want to communicate on Twitter, you must follow their rules. You can talk only about what they want to talk about, the way they want to talk about it, or you're not allowed. Facebook, if you want to communicate with 2.2 billion people worldwide, you better do what they say. Google has the power now to affect, get this, it was a study that was just done at Stanford. Google has the power to affect up to 80% of the undecided votes in any election. Google can decide who is and who isn't president of the United States. If you want to have any impact on Google, you better do what Google wants. If you're YouTube and if you're Dennis Prager and you have a video about the Korean War, you're demonetized and put out of business, or they try to. That's on YouTube. We as conservatives have to recognize the existential nature of this. We have to recognize we've gone a long way since 1987, but in the last 5 years in the wrong direction. This is not, and this is the key point that I want to leave you with, this is not censorship in the United States. This is worldwide. And it's not just worldwide, but it's the biggest worldwide attack in the history of man. Now, I want to go back to the very first thing I asked. What is your number one issue? Whatever is your number one issue, your number one aspiration, it will never succeed if they succeed. Let me repeat that. It will never succeed if they succeed. If they succeed, it's not socialism, we're already there. If they succeed, it's totalitarianism. Now, America's never seen that movie, but we know how it ends. So, I'm going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, whatever it is you care about, make that your second concern. Your first concern is the ability to communicate with your fellow man. If you can't do that, you can't do anything. I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.